Welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the nonprofit accounting podcast. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler. With me, as always, is Mark Palardy.
Hey, everyone.
Got a great show, a couple articles for us. We'll start off with leaders of aggressive congressional investigations of philanthropy, past, present, and future. We'll talk a little bit about congressional oversight of nonprofits, how that's worked in the past. Maybe what we see leading into the future. What does the future of nonprofit oversight look like? And will we find a congressional hearing on nonprofits at some point in the future? It's possible. We'll talk about it. Our next article is focusing governmental service delivery on a new North Star. How can technology help with the overwhelming time stall and time tax that it takes when you're applying or delivering governmental services, and how that relates to maybe your nonprofit that isn't in a governmental sector? How should you think about leveraging technology and when not to leverage technology in a setting like that? We'll talk about all that. Really great article from our social Stanford review articles that we usually get into that are usually pretty meaty. So we'll talk about all that. And then our last article of the week is Endowment Gifts for Nonprofits, the legacy of giving and sustainability. Is an endowment right for your nonprofit? What size of endowment should you take on for your nonprofit? And what does an endowment policy look like? The ins and outs of endowments. We've talked about it before. We'll probably talk about it again, but I think it's a good thing to talk about because it's always this kind of white horse in philanthropy that everybody thinks of as a silver bullet. And we'll talk more about it on this episode. And then our question of the week, or our topic of the week, is the true cost of PTO. What does raising your PTO limits for employees do financially for you? What are the best practices for accounting for PTO? How you figure out what your PTO liability is? The difference between PTO, vacation, and sick time. There is a difference, although they're usually used interchangeably. We'll talk about all that and more on this episode of Profitless on Purpose. But Mark, you have our first article for us. Why don't you take it away?
Yeah, thanks, AJ. This article is from Capital Research, although I found that it's been posted all over the place. And it's called Leaders of Aggressive Congressional Investigations of Philanthropy, Past and Potential Future. So this article by Michael E. Hartman is basically taking us into a historical deep dive as to how philanthropy has been treated by Congress and how policymakers have looked at philanthropic organizations, and are philanthropic organizations just existing as pet projects for specific organizations, or are they there for the greater good? And what has been the congressional oversight? And I thought this was kind of interesting because we talk a lot about what's going on currently, but we haven't done a real deep historical dive about the history of philanthropy in the U.S. and how that's been affected and kind of some of the machinations. So basically, the guy is positing that policymakers are constantly kind of getting in there. There are some administrations that are a little more hands-off and some that are more hands-on, but he is positing that there may be an aggressive desire to examine parts of philanthropy and what we're calling philanthropy in the future coming up. And there are varying levels of intensity. So there have been critiques about tax incentivized and preferred philanthropy in the US. Sometimes it has an anti-democratic nature because people have their pet projects. It warehouses assets. In other words, people who might be giving or paying more taxes are warehousing their assets in a specific place earmarked for their philanthropic desires. And it becomes there is the tendency of politicization. Oh my gosh, I can't even say that today. Politicization of an actual charity that's supposed to be there for the common good, but it becomes political. So this happens kind of on both sides of the coin, whether it's progressive, whether it's populist. And there are frequently critiques of grant making and foundations and other organizations and the way they, if it's not kind of on your home team, then potentially it's not beneficial to you, and we should do something about this. So basically, we're going to go back to the 50s, where there started a committee in Congress. I mean, obviously, we have charities going back farther than that, but in 1953, there was a House Select Committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations and comparable organizations. So this is when the oversight of charities really started to come into effect. And the main contribution was to expose instances where promotion of political ends favored by foundation managers had been disguised as charitable or educational activities. So here we are 70 years later. Luckily, none of that is happening in today's world. So they basically wanted to look at whether foundations can still be giving money if they have specific agendas. And they wanted to recommend a moratorium on granting tax exemption for these kind of foundations. Then later in the 60s, the Reform Act put conditions on what tax preference including how much political involvement you can have if you're a nonprofit organization. And this gave rise to some worries by some nonprofits for their tax status moving forward and whether they were going to get this nice deduction on their taxes. Either kind of administration or either kind of whoever's in power can, in both houses, in both the Senate and in Congress, can create an independent or select committee to examine these things. And so he kind of brings us up to current and talks about whether we're actually still doing this kind of oversight, and that some administrations there's a Senate philanthropy caucus and other caucuses to look at foundations and grant making, and whether we're doing this for political purposes or, the tax exemption that really happens. And, there's questions that are being asked, I think, on both sides of the aisle, although the author in this case seems to kind of favor and bolster the Republican side of the argument. But he's asking, is what he's asking or positing that these congressmen should be asking is what the charities are doing really charitable? Are they going to justify the significant tax breaks that they get? And how is that going? So, I think it depends. We could probably pinpoint examples on both sides where people have their pet projects and people have their, ideas of what they want to contribute to. And, there was, I would say, a dust up a few years ago where a lot of right-wing organizations were saying that they weren't getting approval by the IRS for their 501c3s. But then on the other side, you see organizations on the right that exist. We talked recently on the podcast about the January 6th legal fund that is, being chartered as a nonprofit to help people who potentially created insurrection in this country. So, the liberalness or the reining in of tax exempt funds is something that Congress does look at, but yet they don't want to be accused of, pinpointing one side or the other, or favoring one side of the aisle or the other when it comes to charities. So I thought it was kind of an interesting dive, political slant notwithstanding. I'm curious what you think, AJ.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. And I think, I think that probably like governmental oversight or change in the way that like nonprofits are either run or like, the transparency in which they are held to might change. I mean, we've already seen some like shakeups in accounting where there were no real shakeups or changes in how accounting was done for nonprofits for years and years and years and years. And then all of a sudden in the past like 5 to 10 years, they've really shaken it up, like net assets with or without donor restrictions, used to be called temporarily restricted net assets and permanently restricted net assets. And that's all changed. But they haven't made a lot of change about the disclosure or about like requirements of a nonprofit or, the classification of funds. For quite a long time, it's been in place since they, moved from like a fund accounting kind of governmental accounting view and moved them more into their own separate, almost like small business type accounting rules. But I think it might happen. And I think the way it's going to happen is actually through bad press. So Mark mentioned like the insurrection fund that got quite a few eyebrows raised, as well as like some other interesting things. And most recently, there was this the BLM or Black Lives Matter nonprofit that supposedly bought like a $6 million mansion with donor funds that came to the news. So I mean, we're not, and and also too the fascination with churches and mega churches and donations that happen, and the tax exempt status and income tax exemption that pastors get, was looked upon a couple of years ago as well. So it's not one side of the aisle or the other. I think as this bad press kind of builds, or you get something that sticks in the headlines. I mean, like we just mentioned a handful of cases or public kind of black eyes on nonprofits and how their money is spent. But if you get these churning out and something sticks, you can bet somebody's going to look at it, and you can maybe extrapolate that into changes being. So I guess my words of wisdom here aren't going to, I mean, it's pretty simple, right? How do you win a game? You score more points than the other team. My suggestion here is just to make sure that if you are leading the charge at a nonprofit or you're involved with one, to ensure that, money is being spent correctly and it is for the greater good. And I think making sure that it serves everybody equally is paramount in a situation, where public disclosure, I mean, you can't go look at Amazon's balance sheet and income statement and all the nitty gritty of it. Well, I guess you can, because they're publicly traded, but you can't go to your local supermarket and understand how that's run. But you can for your local nonprofit by pulling their 990, and if they have an audit, and make it available, often they do. So it's very much, transparency is paramount in a nonprofit, but also you're legislated in, or you're required to do these things. So I would say ensuring that, your nonprofit is on the up and up and not getting caught with your name in the headlines is, very strongly advocated. But I think also too, just realizing that this is on the horizon and understanding this is a very fluid landscape. If you would have asked somebody that was in this profession 15 years ago if they thought there was going to be major changes to like the accounting or the accounting treatment of how nonprofits are treated, they probably would have said no. Fast forward, there has been quite a lot of changes. And I think from a policy standpoint, or from like a legislative or legal standpoint about what a nonprofit does and how they do it, I think the same could be said about that it's, change might be coming, and nothing is ever set in stone, and just be aware that I think if we continue to see a rise in like these misappropriation of funds stories, or the preferential treatment of one side versus another, and it can flip flop from who's being, having preferential treatment, depending on what the outcry is, that I think you will see somebody, at least a congressional committee like they're talking about, convene to at least look at these type of issues.
Yeah, I agree with you, AJ. I think this laissez-faire attitude of, well, let's just, we have rules in place and we'll just let it kind of roll and let it happen as it happens, doesn't really work in the nonprofit sphere when you have these new regulations coming in, these new laws being passed. And I think there needs to be some oversight. I mean, we've talked probably ad nauseum on this podcast about cryptocurrency, right? That's something that needs some Senate oversight as to how funds are coming in, and if that's a tax deduction still, and how we even treat cryptocurrency. And, donor advised funds is another thing that this article brings up, right? Because they talked way back when, 60, 70 years ago, about sequestration of funds and sequestration of assets. And if I'm a Rockefeller and I have a foundation, I'm marketing back to the old days, but every single Rockefeller that was ultra wealthy, they sort of started their own foundations, and they each had their pet project that they're going to build this road or this bridge or this, and it was like what they wanted for themselves at the cost of, taking kind of tax money out of the coffers of the rest of the country. And donor advised funds can be viewed in a similar light, but more democratized, where everybody's kind of squirreling away their money that they want to eventually donate to some earmarked charity. But, it's not going to the charity yet. And it's just kind of sitting in savings as a tax-free benefit. So, there are definitely new and unique and creative ways that nonprofits figure out to get money. And I think Senate oversight in these kinds of things, or congressional oversight in general, is good. I think we need to be very mindful not to favor one political side over the other, or, maybe heaven help us, we'll eventually have a third political party that can, give us a run for our money. But anyway, that's a way another topic. So before I veer too far, AJ, why don't we bring us to our second article today?
Yeah, for those that wondering anything about warehousing assets, we have an article at the end of the podcast regarding endowment. So stick around. We'll talk about warehousing assets in a bit here. But my article actually for this week is from Stanford Social Innovation Review. It's always a mouthful, and it's always heady articles that we glean from them. But I think they're always good conversational starters. So this one is focusing on governmental service delivery on a new North Star. And what is that North Star? What the author is mainly talking about is the delivery of governmental services and the lack of technology innovation that happens around this. And so if anybody that's listening to this has ever worked in a governmental setting or has received governmental benefits, harken back to your school days when you had to fill out the FAFSA forms and, answer 50 different kind of questions on getting your student aid in every semester or quarter or year that you had to do those applications. It's been so long I can't remember, but I think it was yearly. Can attest to how filling out those forms and forms after forms and systems that require actual physical stamps need to be processed before it can move forward. If anybody's ever applied for a state or county or federal job, can attest to the lengthy requirements that are listed, and then filling out essentially a form, an 80-page, form of repetitive question and answers. They can attest to kind of what they talk about as like a time tax if anybody is trying to get into that sector of work, and how it can be a real roadblock. Not just in employment, but for services. If you've ever had to apply for governmental services, you can probably attest, how much time it takes and how much, I guess, hoops you have to jump through to be able to get anything to work or to get any services rendered. And the pandemic really put a microscope on all this and really kind of let the people that may or not have been in the position of having to jump through these hoops before, correctly saw the antiquated unemployment systems collapse under the weight of such vast unemployment, and food benefits then also collapsing underneath the weight of everybody trying to apply for them. And the fact that there was real bottlenecks in all those systems to try and move people forward to get access to those needed services that were offered, but often took months, maybe even a year to actually come to fruition, at which point, they had been living in abject poverty for that long time. So the author has a couple answers to this, or suggestions. She's very well, she's been in government and has led these technological advancement kind of committees and now runs her own nonprofit in these. And so what I'd like to do is, read these kind of answers, but think about how they relate to if you're at a non-governmental nonprofit or somebody that's outside of the governmental realm, to think about how these apply to yourself. So they talk about cultivating and supporting diverse tech leaders for the public sector. And what that means is engaging people that understand the problem. I think that can find blind spots in the delivery of those systems, and how technology either hinders that or helps it. Tech is not always the answer, and you need people in place that know whether or not tech is the answer, and making sure that you have high-level diverse tech leaders in your organization, not just in the public sector, and making hiring easier. We talked earlier about those, if you've ever tried to apply for a state or governmental job, the mountain of questions and hoops you have to jump through, and numbers of kind of application steps that you have to go through are dizzying. I have a personal story I can share later, but it's not a fun ride if you're trying to apply for a governmental job, unless you're already in the belly of the beast, and then it might be easier. The second kind of answer she has is to elevate operational process, or to make operational processes like procurement, budgeting, and hiring in a technical around technical issues or the deployment of technology easier. Right now, procurement, if you're in a governmental unit, is very much regimented. You have to follow this very specific guideline and cost threshold and documentation process. And it usually favors large amounts of money spent over several years versus small, iterations, which usually software is built on. You have a working prototype or model or proof of concept, put that in, release it, and then you're iterating upon this software as it's deployed and making it better and better as it's in use. And so if you can remember back when the Obamacare, the American Health Care Act came into effect, we saw this with the rollout of the healthcare.gov that was 2 years in the making. Oregon's own website, if you live in the state of Oregon, was a complete disaster that was years in the making, that wasted millions and millions and millions of dollars at the federal level, probably billions, to get just a website up and running, which seems, mind-boggling that was the case. And then the last one is build institutional capacity and accelerate the delivery of human-centered services. This is the one that I thought was really interesting in her bullet points here, was because the technologist, or the deployment of the technology, needs to be engaged with career civil servants who know, who can accelerate and institutionalize effective delivery. They're the ones that have been working in this sector and understand how the either the services or the money is delivered to the people that are most in need, and the bottlenecks within that, and what would make their life easier in delivering or identifying people for those services and delivery of money. And I think that's a real real bullet point that we should think about and discuss further, because I think often when we think about like the delivery of a new technology or trying to make providing services easier, we often forget to rope in those people that are quote unquote in the trenches or boots on the ground that deliver these services and are the lifeline between the people that need them and the nonprofit or the governmental unit that is handing them out. And I think realistically, that is, I think that probably should have been the first bullet point, is wrapping these people in with that. But I've rabbled on long enough here, Mark. I'd love to know your thought on kind of the article and her quote unquote answers or solutions that she has for the problem.
Yeah, I enjoyed this article, but I think if I were to give it one adjective, it would be aspirational, because we've all worked with government accounting in some form or another. If you filed your tax return, you've worked for governmental accounting in some form or another. Assuming you're in the US, of course. Our vast international listening audience might not relate to this, but technology is such a key to all sorts of different aspects of working business models. But technology is so unimportant, or gets such short shrift when it comes to governmental agencies. And AJ was bringing up that great example of the Affordable Care Act and how they truly borked that website thing, and millions of dollars in waste went to companies that had nothing to show for it. The other piece that always comes to mind is, as an accountant, I sometimes have to contact on behalf of my clients the IRS. If you've ever had to deal with the IRS and provide them documentation, yes, it is 2022, and you still have to fax them stuff, right? They don't even have a system where you can electronically email them or attach documents of any sort. Everything has to go via fax. I mean, so this is why I say an article like this, great tips, great tricks, hire from within and know who your tech people are and kind of bolster the whole system from within. There are other tips here about, on tribal lands, getting people invested in this, and, having all these different pieces of the puzzle playing in and getting us more up to speed. I don't know how it's going to happen, though. I mean, there's not a budget for this that is meaningful, right? We have a lot of programs out there to help with the digital divide, between communities, but we don't have any sort of help for governmental digital divide. And, the the general rule is that, you know, if you're a good accountant, you go work for a company. If you're not a great accountant, you go work for the government. And that's horrible to think about, but it's like, well, you know, if I were an accountant out there looking for work, and do I want to go somewhere where they're probably still using DOS you know, on their computers, you know, that where their computers can't even run Excel yet? Like, this is ridiculous. You know, I don't want to do double ledger accounting on these wide journal entry sheets. So aspirational. I'll come back to that because I think there are some great ideas in here, and I think we probably just need somebody at the top, a technologically minded president or, you know, council that really is interested in bringing the infrastructure of technology up to speed. I know we're doing a lot of infrastructure spending right now when it comes to roads and bridges and et cetera, but the technological infrastructure that the government needs, you know, just go to the DMV, go fill out a form for a grant. You know, the ridiculousness of the paper heavy. Okay, I could just go on, and I feel like I am. So I'll leave it there.
No, I totally. I mean, I once applied for. I think it was like not tax investigator, maybe an auditor. Anyway, it was like one of these county tax positions, you know. And I actually called ahead of time and said, "Hey, you guys, you know, say that you require like 2 years experience, but you'll take a degree in lieu of," right? And so they said, absolutely, you know, like if you have your bachelor's degree, that will, you know, serve in lieu of the experience thing. Great. So I got on there, applied for the job. 2 months later, I hear back and said, "Oh, you don't have experience. It clearly stated you needed 2 years experience." I didn't even bother following back up because I couldn't believe that it took them that long to respond to an application that was submitted like 2 or 3 months ago to just let me know, like, oh, if you want to apply again, you have to go through this 40-page, you know, application again just to work at a state agency to be, you know, a county tax auditor. And I was like, forget this, you know, I can, and I think that speaks to a larger thing where, especially in these governmental hiring things, they're, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's working for us now. It may be cumbersome, but we seem to get, quote unquote, the right people in here. And what they mean by the right people is they were willing to sit and wait and fill out these forms and wait months upon months to get called back. And I just feel like there has to be a better way to do this, you know. And I think, you know, even though I filled this out on a website, it didn't go any quicker. I'm sure it had to be printed out and somebody had to manually review this or something and put an ink stamp on it so that it was rejected, you know, and that's why it took so long. I think, you know, to Mark's point, I think there's, you know, there can be technologically, you know, like deployment or technological deployment, deployment that could make all of these things easier. But I think cybersecurity probably is the boogeyman. You know, a lot of people don't understand it. You know, oh my God, if you can register to vote on a website, how do we stop voter fraud? You know, we can barely handle it now when in fact there's probably little to no voter fraud that we know of that's ever been uncovered. But, you know, it's like the boogeyman in the room. You know, if you can instead of faxing your, you know, transcripts to the IRS, you could email them. Well, how do we know that somebody is not, you know, how do you know that somebody's not illegal, you know, faxing in false documents? You know, it's not like a fax shows a picture of you next to the fax machine with your ID, putting your documents into the fax machine, and who knows where it ends up at the IRS when it gets there. I mean, I used to have I had a teacher, this was 10 years ago, and she said when she quit working for the IRS, they were still using carbon copy forms, and they were like shortchanged on it, and they would have to reuse the carbon copy. And it's like, are you kidding me? You know, this was in the 2000s. I mean, you're talking about, you know, like just an archaic way of working and an archaic way of getting things done. But we've seen it on the other side. I mean, we've had clients that do not want to get out of doing things by paper. I had a partner at a tax firm tell me that they would never go paperless because paper is better, and that, like, they would never advise a client to use paperless systems unless it, like, they could be shown that it was as as secure as paper. And it's an old school mentality, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and they can't see that it's broken, I think. So yeah, I don't know. But I guess we'll move on to our question of the week here.
I'm glad there are people out there still fighting the good fight, though. I will say that, because it's necessary and it's not going to change otherwise.
No. And, let's, it keeps paper mills and jobs in the paper industry around. So we'll see. But yeah, carbon copies, I don't know. Mark's got another article. What do you got for us, Mark?
Yeah, this one is from our friends over at Nonprofit Hub, called Endowment Gifts for Nonprofits, Legacies of Giving and Sustainability. So this article is kind of an intro article about what an endowment is and how an endowment works, which, for those of you who might not be in the know, an endowment basically is when someone, often a very wealthy donor, wants to give a large sum of money to an organization for that money to theoretically be used in perpetuity. And often how this plays out is that then it is invested in some way, and then there is a drawdown on that endowment every year, usually at or near what the investment percentage would be. So that, if we're assuming that this endowment grows at 5% per year, then we do a 5% draw on the money so that we can then spend that money every year, and often on a specific, these are your restricted monies, permanently restricted monies that usually have a specific purpose for them, right? You might endow a new building, you might endow a position. There's often the endowed chair of blah, blah, blah. That means that part of their salary is being paid, if not all of it, from an endowment interest earnings. So when often wealthy donors or a group of donors or investors want to get together and believe in an organization so much that they want it to have money in perpetuity, that's where an endowment often comes in. And I've not seen it where an endowment is just going to general unrestricted funds, but I suppose an endowment could be written however the endower wants it endowed. And how many times can I say endow in one sentence? Anyway, so the idea of this article is that there's a hurdle for small and mid-sized nonprofits with this idea that, well, I'm too small to have an endowment, right? But high wealth donors love giving endowments, right? They're, let's be honest, there's an ego thing at play here. So they want their name on something that's going to outlast their lifetime. And oftentimes bequests, something that happens upon somebody's death, is often sort of, if you don't get the money all at once, it's often put into an endowment so that person's legacy is sustainable. And so small and medium-sized organizations sometimes don't go for endowments because they're like, we're not big enough for that. We're not prestigious enough. We don't have enough name recognition. But people with money, people with a lasting legacy, might want to still endow. And, if I'm some mid-sized donor, but let's say I don't have any kids, and when I pass, I want to pass my wealth on to a nonprofit organization and have it endowed in something, I might not be a Rockefeller like we mentioned earlier on, but I might have a substantial retirement account that doesn't go to anybody, and I want it to go to a charity. So this is an opportunity for small and mid-sized nonprofits to kind of look and appeal to people. And, development departments clearly know about this stream of income, but they often don't focus on it because it's tricky for planning purposes, and it's tricky to nurture a financial relationship with a donor such that, death is a difficult topic to discuss if you're talking bequests. Or even asking the big ask for endowments is sometimes difficult if you don't have a major donor person, if you don't have an executive director that really is in on that track. So with this kind of dedicated source of long-term funding, you can really help support your mission, and you can really kind of tweak your funding and have some guaranteed income that could sustain you. I mean, this article also talks about micro endowments, right? Where you can have lots of little endowments, or those can look like scholarships, etc. But there's lots of different ways to do this. So, AJ, what are some of your thoughts on endowments?
Well, I take it. So first of all, the article is very tight, and like most things from that usually describe this on Nonprofit Hub, at the very end, hey, if you're interested in creating an endowment and your own endowment, Infinite Giving helps nonprofits create this. Get a hold of us, and you can do it. So it's almost like an ad space for something that revolves around endowments. I think, from my experience, endowments are usually meaty. They usually happen once in a great while, and they can be tricky to undertake if you don't understand the ins and outs of them. So let's lay some ground rules here, and kind of like my own take on what they consider micro endowments. If you have endowments, you need to track those investments separately from anything else that you have in your organization, because they are a separate disclosure. You need to track earnings to be able to show, if donors ever asked about it, future generations, if it's a bequest, would ask about how the money's being spent or want to see like the books on that stuff. They are more than capable of asking that, and the nonprofit should make that. So my point is, you can't commingle those funds with like your operating reserve. So it does mean that you're going to have a separate investment account for this endowment. The other thing that means is that they're kind of a pain in the neck when, like setting them up and getting them in. It can take years to cultivate an endowment gift. And usually a lot of smaller and medium-sized nonprofits are, to be quite frank, they're probably better on building up their reoccurring donations year to year, or investing in grant writing or something that would probably be, have a better rate on return for the time invested. But these can be quite the windfall if you get them. So two things I would say, like you need to set a threshold of what you would accept it as an endowment gift for your organization, and really understand what it takes to maintain that endowment gift. Meaning, like if somebody puts in $500 for an endowment gift, it's not going to do the donor or your nonprofit much good. But if you had 100 people donate $500 and you had $50,000, that might be different. So I take issue with them saying bring in micro amounts. Now if you already have an endowment that has a good amount, you can do a campaign and have people donate for as little as $10, $25 to just tack on to what you already have available. But you're not going to get much from your $500 endowment year after year, even if you'd reinvested the interest and dividends earnings on the investment earnings back into that fund. So be aware that, and there's more hoops to jump through if you ever need that money to get out. It's a misconception that you can never spend endowment money. You most certainly can spend the principal of the endowment if needed. Just realize that, especially if you have it at one of these black box managed money or money managed kind of endowment funds. We have one locally that's known as OCF. You have to jump through a lot of hoops to be able to get that original investment out, or any part of it. They will send you the earnings or allow you to reinvest them, but the principal that is invested can be very difficult to get out if a nonprofit is in the unfortunate circumstance where they need to use something that's been put away like that. The other thing to note is it creates about a page worth of disclosure notes on your financial statements if they're audited, or if you have a full set of financial statements, realizing that it will probably add to the cost of your audit, and figuring that into the cost benefit ratio of understanding of taking one of these on. So again, an endowment is donor directed, not board directed. You can have a board endowment or a board directed endowment, but it's really a quasi endowment. It doesn't fall under the same scrutiny and rules that a true endowment does. So understanding the difference between the two, and understanding the difference in amounts of money and the kind of hoops you have to jump through in an endowment, I think it's a much more careful thought if you're going to get into this than what the article is leading on to be, and purporting to be.
No, I think those are great points, AJ. I mean, I like the idea of an endowment, but there is a nuts and bolts aspect to accounting for endowments. I know I'll speak from personal experience. We had an endowment in a former place that I worked, and multiple people giving to multiple projects, and tracking it every month was a chore. And with a few of the people, they hadn't established rules in place. So we would have some people who wanted to keep contributing to their endowment, and they would give $100 every quarter, right? And so you would have to recast that amount and then figure out what percentage of their endowment, was going to come out for their draw for the year based on these minuscule amounts of contributions. And because the tracking can become so onerous, it's like they probably spent more in accounting time than they did for that $100 that they got. So, establish guardrails, when you are going to accept money, maybe once a year from a specific donor, or, what that's going to look like, what the minimum thresholds are, and, while an endowment is a great thing, as AJ pointed out, sometimes a recurring gift works much better in a situation like that. So I will agree. And we'll move on to our topic of the week.
Yeah. All right. So I have a question here about the cost of PTO. So this is a nonprofit that offers a certain set amount, 96 hours of PTO hours to be accrued per year, meaning if you're a full-time employee, you get 96 hours, roughly, what is that, 2 weeks and some change of time off that you accrue over that year. And essentially they want to raise that amount of PTO. So they don't offer sick time. They don't offer any of that. There is a policy in place that shows how much, a cap essentially on how much PTO will be paid out when an employee leaves. And I'm assuming that there's a cap on what can be carried from year to year. So, and what those caps are set to do is to minimize or at least project the amount of possible or the maximum amount of liability a nonprofit would have if everybody just decided to walk out and they had to pay this accrued PTO out upon the departure of many employees. So what the board wants to know, though, this is interesting because they want to raise that PTO accrual per year to remain competitive with other nonprofits in their area. And the board wants to know what the financial burden this would create to the organization. And the author the person writing this is essentially pondering, has anybody come across this? How would I calculate that? And is this something, does it sound like we have a sound PTO policy? So I'll let our resident payroll expert here wax poetic about PTO and the accrual of it. And maybe I can throw in my 2 cents after he's done, giving us the business on PTO.
Yeah, first let's get a couple definitions in place for those who aren't aware, because this is something I had to learn kind of when I started looking at some HR functions. PTO, paid time off, versus vacation time versus sick time. So when you're looking at it from a definitional standpoint, people use them interchangeably, especially PTO and vacation. But from a definitional standpoint for your organization, PTO is paid time off that often comes in a big lump sum that includes both vacation and sick. If somebody leaves the organization and they have accrued or built up some of this PTO, they get paid out for that PTO. Now, on the other side, if a company has a separate vacation and sick policy, when an employee leaves the organization, often they will only get paid out for the vacation policy and not the sick time. So benefits and disadvantages to both. Obviously, the disadvantage of having just a PTO policy is that if I get sick, I don't want to dip into what I consider to be my vacation. So I'm more likely to come to work sick rather than use this PTO pool that I have, because I don't want to, a lot of employees think of this as vacation time, even though it is both vacation and sick combined. And for the employer, having to pay out somebody sick upon leaving is not something that's that appealing either. That being said, there are also local requirements that you have to be able to fulfill. So, For example, in the state of Oregon, where we're currently located, there is an Oregon sick policy as well. So you have to make sure that if you have a PTO policy, that it matches or exceeds what that Oregon sick policy is going to allow for sick time. Usually it would, but you have to be mindful of these things. And especially if you have two separate policies, your sick policy has to at least meet the threshold of the Oregon sick. Now, with the accrual question that comes into play here, basically the way I've done it and the way I've been advised in audit to do it is what you want to do on your financials is at the end of the year, you look at how much sick time or PTO time somebody has rolling over into the next year, and you value that for each employee at effectively their hourly rate. Doesn't matter if they're salaried, you just kind of chop that up, figure out what their effective hourly rate is. And then you multiply it by how many PTO hours that you have. You add all those accruals up and you get one liability number that if the business shut down tomorrow, this is what you would have to pay out in PTO or vacation time, if you will. So when a board wants to increase that, effectively what they're saying is, we want to budget for more PTO. What does that look like? And that's a pretty easy calculation. I mean, not easy, but it's a calculation that can be done. If you know what everybody's hourly rate is, you add 5 hours to that and you see what the cost to the organization is, and you accrue that on the year end. I mean, usually this calculation is done once a year. You could do it every month, you could do it quarterly, but frankly, that would be a hassle. It really just needs to be correct on the year end, fiscal year or calendar year and financials, whatever basis you're on. So that would be my advice to this person, is just kind of determine where you're at, what your rollover policy is too, right? Because some people say, yeah, you have to use it all, or you can roll over 2 weeks, or you can roll over 6 weeks, because that's going to be a large determining factor of how much liability you have. You might not want to offer more PTO to employees. You might just say, well, instead of rolling over 2 weeks, we're going to let you roll over 3 weeks. Well, that's going to increase your liability for those people who don't take vacations very often and want to save it up. Or do you have a payout policy, right? Because some employers do. So there's obviously lots of little variables that can come into play here, but basically you're just trying to figure out, without changing too much, are you giving more vacation? Are you letting them roll over more vacation? And how much do you want to show up on the books as a liability?
Yeah, I think all really great points and really thorough there, Mark. One thing I would say is when drafting, and of course you need to have a PTO policy, as Mark talked about, and make it really clear on what somebody carries over and how they can use it. And what kind of, if you have separate, vacation and sick time accrued, then what are the requirements to be eligible for the sick time? Are you just going to take the employee's word for it? Do they need a doctor's note? How long does that last? When does it cut over to vacation time or unpaid time if you're sick after you exhaust those hours? Can you use vacation hours for sick time if you've exhausted your sick time? All that should be addressed in the policy, as well as being able to understand, like Mark said, the payout at the end, if you leave or you're terminated, what that looks like, what the rollover is. And I think the other part that I would say to consider, and it's something that I've seen left out of either policies, either in the PTO section or in the allocation section of how things are to be done, is how you allocate PTO. Some governmental grants require you that you book them under administrative because they weren't directly working on the project that they were assigned to if you're taking paid time off. Others will allow you to allocate PTO the same way you do salaries and wages to their programs. So being aware of your grant requirements and understanding how the PTO usage itself and those hours that an employee gets paid for will be logged into the accounting system, and in which way are they, being an expense for either a grant or a program or for administrative purposes. So I think that's one more thing that you need to look for when you're drafting these or thinking about either increasing, decreasing, rolling over PTO, is how the adjustment in those PTO hours and the usage of those, including sick time, gets distributed through your financial statements and how they get pinged to either projects or grants.
Yeah, and AJ, you just reminded me also, as you're budgeting, right, you've got to also consider, when do these policies start, right? Do you wait 3 months before you start getting vacation or PTO? And if you're doing a hiring push in the following year, you're going to have to budget. If I'm hiring on January 1, as of April 1, I got to start figuring for vacation or PTO, depending. So lots of variables. Just get it in writing, get clear. I've seen at an organization I worked at, donated sick time. Boy, was that a pain in my ass. But all these little nuances that can be negotiated and can be great for employees, but can be a hassle for those who have to track it or have to be kept in mind. All right. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up another episode of Profitless on Purpose. We really appreciate you being here and contributing and just engaging with us. Obviously, you can leave a comment on the YouTube video. You can tweet at us at ProfitlessPod on Twitter, and soon we're going to call it Elon Musk's Twitter because that's the way we're headed. On behalf of AJ and myself, we really appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to having you here next time on the podcast. See ya.
Thanks, everybody.